So in the last lecture, you learned how to handle uncaught exceptions. So if there is an exception in your application and you have not caught that exception using a catch block, you can subscribe to uncaught exception of the process object. And here you can log the error using Winston. However, this approach only works with synchronous code. In other words, if you have a promise somewhere and that promise is rejected, this code will not be executed. Let me show you. So here on line 29, we are throwing an exception. Let's replace this with a rejected promise. So constant p, we set this to promise dot reject. Now here we pass an error object and a message like failed miserably. So imagine this promise represents the result of an asynchronous operation like a call to a database or a remote HTTP service and so on. So we have a rejected promise. Now, as I told you before, with promises, we either call then, and then we should call catch to make sure to handle rejections. Or if we're using the async and await syntax, so we await the promise, but we should put this in a try catch block to catch the exceptions or rejections. Now in this code, we have a promise, and I'm going to call then, pass a simple callback, console.log, done, but I'm not going to call catch. So we'll have an unhandled rejection. Let's see what happens. So back in the terminal, node index.js. All right, look at this warning. You have seen this before. Unhandled promise rejection. And here's our error. Now with the current version of Node, this unhandled promise rejection does not terminate the Node process. But as you can see in this warning message, in the future, promise rejections that are not handled will terminate the Node.js process. So you can see this process is still running. We're connected to MongoDB. We're not in the terminal. In the future, when we have an unhandled promise rejection, we'll end up here. So the process will crash. So now let me show you how to deal with unhandled promise rejections. This process object has another event similar to uncaught exception called unhandled rejection. We can subscribe to that. So I'm going to select this code, duplicate it, and change the event name to unhandled rejection. Again, note the spelling. And here we can change our message to we got an unhandled rejection. Okay. Now, before we run the application, I want to show you in our log file, we only have one message, and this came from catching an uncaught exception. But when we ran the application a few seconds ago, we had an unhandled promise rejection. We could not log that, right? Now, with this new code, when we handle this rejection, we'll log it using Winston. So let's verify this. Back in the terminal, let's run the application again. All right, here's our message. We got an unhandled rejection. And now if you look at the log, look, here is our unhandled promise rejection. Now, one last thing. Whether you're dealing with an uncaught exception or an unhandled rejection, as a best practice, you should terminate the node process. So you should exit here, because at this point, your process can be in an unclean state. So as a best practice, we should terminate the process and restart it to make sure we start with a clean state. Now, you might ask, if we terminate the process, how are we going to restart it in production? Well, there are tools for that, which we call process managers. And in the future, we're going to look at one of those tools. So here, I'm going to modify this code. We no longer need this console.log. We'll simply log the error using Winston and then exit the process with 1. So as I told you before, 0 means success. Anything but 0 means failure. I'm going to make the same change to this other function. Done. Now, there is also a different way to write this code. So instead of these 3 lines, we can call one of the helper methods in Winston. So Winston has this method handle exceptions. Here we need to pass one or more transport objects. So new Winston dot transports dot file. We pass an options object here and set the file name to something like uncaught exceptions.log. So note that when we call handle exceptions, we're specifying a different transport than the one we have configured with our default logger. Now you may use the same file name or a different file name, that's entirely up to you. You can also have multiple transports. One question you might have is whether you should log messages to a file or to a database like MongoDB. There are different opinions about this, but I personally believe you should use both transports because each transport has strengths and weaknesses. MongoDB or other databases is good for querying data. So if you want to create a client application for querying your log, it's much easier to query the data in MongoDB as opposed to a flat file like this. However, it is possible that your MongoDB server goes down or you cannot connect to it for whatever reason. In that case, it's better to use the file system because file system is always available. So this is handle exceptions. Now, at the time of recording this video, this only works for uncaught exceptions. So if you have unhandled rejections, this method is not going to log those exceptions. But I'm going to show you a trick to make that work. So I personally prefer to use handle exceptions method than manually subscribing to uncaught exception event of the process object. I explained this so you know how this works internally. So let's remove this and just rely on Winston that handle exceptions. Now, when we have an unhandled promise rejection, instead of this code, we can simply throw this exception, and here we'll have an unhandled exception. So Winston would automatically catch that, log it in our file, and then terminate the process.